the sermon, we're going to invite all the new members who have joined the church recently to come forward. I believe there's about 9 folks here today, and we will do a short new member recognition of those people, but that's later on. So in order to become a Unitarian Universalist minister, it's necessary for us to complete 3 years at least of seminary. And part of those 3 years is to spend 11 weeks serving as a chaplain. Sometimes it's chaplain in a prison, sometimes it's a chaplain in some other institution, but most commonly it's a chaplaincy in a hospital. In 1976, I was 25 years old and studying to become a minister in the Unitarian Universalist movement, and I was accepted to serve as a chaplain in a hospital called Presbyterian Hospital in San Francisco. It's merged and no longer has that name, and joined 5 other seminary students plus an experienced chaplain supervisor in a meeting in San Francisco at the hospital. The supervisor pulled me aside and said, we assign the chaplains to different parts of the hospital. I'm going to assign you, Roger, to the alcohol treatment program as the chaplain there. And let me explain the reason I chose you. The folks who work on the staff of the alcohol treatment program and also the clients are deeply suspicious of religion because in their experience, ministers tend to tell people who drink too much that they're sinners and that that's not very helpful in terms of their recovery to be called a sinner. But we found that Unitarian Universalists don't do that. And so we tend, when we have a Unitarian Universalist student chaplain, to assign that person to the alcohol treatment program. So that's why I ended up there. I knew almost nothing about alcoholism when I arrived there. But it's a 3-week program, and I was there for 11 weeks. So I went through it almost 4 times and became a real expert in at least that program and the way they dealt with the problem of alcohol abuse. I learned all kinds of things I didn't know about. There was a long lecture by a medical doctor about the effects of drinking alcohol on the body. He said, the image that stuck in my mind still today is that when you take a drink of hard liquor like whiskey or vodka straight, that our esophagus is covered by a mucus lining which protects us from foods or drinks that are extremely hot or extremely acidic, and that when we drink strong alcoholic beverages, the alcohol temporarily dissolves that mucus lining, making us more subject to pain and heartburn, and that long-term illnesses can result from this process. So still today, on rare occasions when I take a drink of hard liquor like whiskey, and I feel it burn as it goes down, in my imagination I can see that mucus lining in my esophagus dissolving. In the program, the doctor described how researchers test drugs on animals before the Food and Drug Administration approves them for human use. He invited us to imagine that alcohol is not an old drug that's been around for 5,000 years, but something of a new drug. Imagine alcohol was just discovered today. A researcher just discovered it. And the FDA decided to test it as they would test new drugs. And if they gave it to mice, the mice would die. If they gave it to rabbits, it would kill the rabbits. If they gave it to a larger mammal, like a dog as a test, the dog would die. If alcohol had to pass the drug test that the FDA requires on other drugs before they approve it for use, use, it would be labeled as a poison. Then the doctor gave us a lecture on depression, drawing brain cells on a board and explaining that depressed people have poor connections between these brain cells. The communication is difficult. And that drinking too much alcohol causes the connections between the cells to grow weaker, increasing the feeling of depression in the drinker. So a depressed person who drinks to feel less depressed will, in the long run, feel more depressed. At lunch one day, I had a private conversation with this medical doctor who gave the lectures. He told me that alcoholism was widespread among priests and Protestant ministers. Rabbis, he said, did not seem to have nearly as much of a problem. He added that most priests and ministers have no clue about how to deal with the problem of drinking in their own congregations. And then he told me his own story. He said, "My parents raised me a Roman Catholic, and I'm still a Roman Catholic, still attend Mass. I drank a lot in college and in medical school. It felt to me like everyone I knew," he said, "was drinking. I liked to have a few beers," he said, "with friends because they relaxed me and they gave me a positive feeling of well-being. I felt more fully alive. I enjoyed the atmosphere of the bar," he said. "I enjoyed the conversation, the jokes, the noise, the young men, the attractive women. Later, when I finished graduate school and I had more income, I learned to enjoy cocktails, and eventually I graduated to try different kinds of whiskeys. Those were good times. I bonded with my friends. I started a medical practice. I got married. I started a family, and we joined a Catholic parish." The doctor said, "At first, I knew I did not have the disease of alcoholism because although I drank in the evening, I got to work on time the next day. Then he said, I knew I did not have the disease because although I got to work late, I always got all my work done. Later on, I knew I did not have the disease because although I missed work occasionally, I was entitled to sick days. The other people on the staff could fill in for me just as I would fill in for them when they were sick. Still later, I did not think anything was seriously wrong with me because although I no longer had a job, they were still glad to see me when I came to church. You see, Roger," he told me, "my standards for acceptable behavior kept changing. And because I was a chaplain," he went on to talk about his religious experience. He said, "At church, they must have smelled the alcohol on my breath. They must have noticed that sometimes my hands were shaking. However, the priest smiled and patted me on the back and kept saying it was good to see me. He was glad I was there. The church helped me keep drinking by helping me feel good about myself. Whatever the reason, no one in the congregation ever challenged me." Well, I said, "You're not drinking now, and you're a specialist in alcoholism here in this treatment program. What happened?" And he said, "The police stopped me from drinking. They stopped me when I was driving drunk. They said I had hit 9 parked cars. I remember I said to them it could not be true, and I became very angry. They handcuffed me, and I shouted that I was a victim. I said the police were destroying my career and my life. The judge gave me a choice of a treatment program or jail. I hated the police. I hated the judge because they set limits on me. They forced me into detox and treatment. Now I know, looking back, that the police and the judge saved my life. But I said, I thought an alcoholic has to want to be helped, has to want help to be helped. The doctor said to me, that's a common misconception. In truth, the courts, the families, or the employer force most alcoholics to enter treatment. They become self-motivated during rather than before treatment. Most of our clients here in this center are here because they were told they would go to jail or they would lose their jobs or both if they did not come to us. So then I said, at this treatment center, what's your rate of success? And he said, an accurate number is impossible to arrive at. We don't make surprise visits into former clients' homes to see if people who finished our program are still sober. We have outpatient support groups here at the hospital that we try to get everyone to join when they finish the program. We do follow-ups by mail and phone call. Nevertheless, people move away or don't answer their mail or lie when we reach them on the phone. Our guess is that in the first year after our program, we have at least a 65% success rate. And this gives us hope that what we are doing is effective. Well, treatment programs like this one, the one I worked at in San Francisco, can help, but they are expensive. So in my ministry, when appropriate, over the years, I have encouraged people to attend meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I encourage friends and families to go to meetings of Al-Anon as a way of getting support when someone in their family, when a close friend, is struggling with alcohol, the disease of alcoholism. When I see a person who has a history of heavy drinking in high school and in college, and then refers to his love of beer 28 times in a job interview, I would encourage this person to seek help from an alcohol treatment program and to follow up attending AA meetings. When I see a woman talk about an alcohol-related sexual assault, I would encourage her to attend Al-Anon meetings because they can give support from others who have had similar experiences. My second story, I have two stories this morning about my own education around alcoholism. And my second story is about the role alcohol abuse played in getting women in the United States the right to vote. In 1985, 9 years after I was in San Francisco, I was called to serve as the minister of the Unitarian Church in Evanston, Illinois. Shortly after I arrived there, we were fortunate enough to have as a guest speaker Studs Terkel from Chicago. And I remember that evening we were sitting there and Studs said to me, Roger, where can we go for a drink after the meeting? And I said, I don't know, Studs. And he said, oh, that's right, Evanston is dry. We'll have to go into Chicago. Which, something I hadn't paid that much attention to, but in fact, I discovered then that Evanston was the home of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. sale of alcoholic beverages was against the law in Evanston. So my education about alcoholism and alcohol abuse continued in Evanston as I served as the minister of the Unitarian Church there and learned about the history of the WCTU. I learned that in the 19th century, American males used beer as a beverage because water was often unsafe. Men thought that beer supplied energy for hard physical labor. In most cities, such as Chicago, there were far more saloons than there were food stores. American saloons in the 19th century were almost exclusively for men. Unitarian Susan B. Anthony, speaking in 1875, emphasized that women were the greatest sufferers from drunkenness. She pointed out that women did not control their own wages and had no legal claim on their husband's earnings. So a husband could drink up both his and his wife's pay. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was a coalition of many religious denominations that grew out of a grassroots women's crusade against saloons that began in Ohio and spread throughout the United States during the winter of 1873 and 1874. Thousands of women in hundreds of communities took to the streets in highly charged protests. They had had enough. They entered saloons and shops that sold alcoholic beverages, and they sang and they prayed. Their goal was to disrupt or close down the liquor trade. This movement transcended class, status, race, and religious boundaries. It attracted supporters from all levels of society. New England Unitarian feminists joined hands with conservative homemakers in small towns in the Midwest and factory working women in industrial cities, all working to overcome a common problem. Abuse from drunken men was the issue on which all women could unite. Studying the history, I learned that Frances Willard of Evanston, Illinois, a prominent Methodist, was the leader. Willard noticed that although in 1874 the Votes for Women movement, the suffrage movement, had the strong support of educated women, the vast majority of women were homemakers, raising children or working in factories and doing traditional 19th century women's work. These conservative Christian women, they didn't see any benefit in being able to vote. Willard saw that the big concern of these women was the heavy beer drinking of their husbands and the sexual violence that came with that drinking. She realized that the way to get conservative women, homemakers, mothers, laborers, active in supporting the right of women to vote was to say, if you can vote, you can elect people who will restrict the sale of alcoholic beverages. In 1879, at the age of 40, Willard was elected president of the National WCTU. She won on a platform that urged the WCTU to support the right of women to vote. She said that only with the right to vote could women elect officials who would support temperance. Willard called the vote for women home protection. Home protection. She argued that a drunken husband was a threat to the home. The idea of home protection made the women's suffrage movement acceptable to many women, conservative women who might not otherwise have supported it. My own conservative Mennonite grandmother, born in 1884, became a member of the WCTU in Idaho and the treasurer of the Idaho WCTU. During the 1880s, Willard traveled, she spoke, and she wrote constantly. The
The WCTU grew from 27,000 members to nearly 200,000. It became the largest women's organization in the history of the world up to that time. Willard went far beyond the temperance issue in her interests and speeches. She spoke before black congregations as well as white, and the WCTU was the first national organization to condemn the lynching of black men. She advocated holding men equally guilty with women in prostitution offenses. Willard said that there was a close relationship between men's drinking too much beer and sexual violence against women. Speaking out against the assaults that often came with heavy beer drinking, she complained that in Massachusetts and in Vermont, it is a greater crime to steal a cow than to abduct and ruin a girl, and that in Illinois, rape is not recognized as a crime. Willard used conservative values of home and family to promote radical ends. Through temperance, which women saw as protection of the home, women from many social and economic strata gradually were caught up in feminist goals. Under her leadership, the WCTU promoted general prison reform, special facilities for women offenders, the 8-hour workday, model facilities for dependent and neglected children, the kindergarten movement, shelters of care for the children of working mothers, social rooms other than salons for the urban poor, federal aid to education, education for mothers, vocational training for women, child labor legislation, and the graduated income tax to end the increasing problem of the super wealthy people controlling all of the money. By the end of the 19th century, Frances Willard was familiar to hundreds of thousands of people. Her picture was displayed in countless homes. In 1898, she died in her sleep at the age of 58, worn out by 25 years of traveling, speech making, and politically active work. The flags in Washington, D.C., as well as Chicago, were lowered to half-mast on the day of her funeral. It was 23 years later, in 1920, that women got the vote. My grandmother, born in 1884, was finally able to vote in her 30s. That same year, prohibition became the law. However, it turned out that neither women's right to vote or prohibition solved the problem of alcohol abuse or sexual assaults. It turns out that progress in this area is slow. The events of the past few days show how far we still have to go. Today, it's estimated that 88,000 people die each year from alcohol-related causes in the United States. Still, I have hope. I have learned that with education, that with counseling, with support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, that recovery is possible from this disease. Today, conservative estimates suggest that 25% of American women have experienced a sexual assault, and that half of these sexual assaults, and this is a conservative estimate, half of them have involved alcohol consumption. Still, I have hope. I have learned from studying our country's history that good women and men can work together to reduce the number of such assaults. Now, each state has the right to put 2 statues in our national capital in Washington. So in 1905, a statue of Frances Willard was given by the state of Illinois. It was the first statue in our national capital honoring a woman. Today, in Statuary Hall, where many
television interviews are given, she looks down. She looks down on the tourists, and she looks down on the members of the Senate and the House. And although there are setbacks in progress, I have hope that in the long run, her vision of an America where all women are treated with sober respect will prevail. Now I invite you, if you've joined the church in the last few weeks, to come forward for our welcoming ceremony. And the words for the ceremony will appear on the screen. Just come right up here to the front.